Welcome aboard Rocket Ship, the platform with the most relevant content for competitive examinations. This is Rocket Ship IAS Lab and continuing with our series on answer writing for general studies papers of civil service main examination. We would take up a question that you might encounter in GS paper 1. Here goes the question. A nation's history cannot remain uninfluenced, this is uninfluenced by the happenings in the wider world. How far this statement fits the Great Rebellion of 1857? So this is the typical kind of question where the first part of the question makes a certain statement, it makes a certain observation, and in the second part you are supposed to give supportive examples, that is examples in support of the observation made in the first part. And you can see it is mostly a fact type question actually, where you do not have to make your interpretation of the question, but rather you are supposed to make examples, as we were just talking about, supportive examples to whatever the point that the question makes. So how are we introducing this answer? Actually, this question talks about the influence of foreign events on the Great Rebellion of 1857. So this is a point that we are going to discuss. But what generally happens that most of the people accept what was the condition domestically that had fueled the Great Rebellion of 1857. So we are starting with the condition at home, that is condition in India, which were directly responsible for the 1857 rebellion. These were some of the things like the political grievances of the dispossessed native rulers, denial of compensations that were promised to them, hurt on the cultural sensitivities of sepoys, and the general economic distress of the 1850s all contributed to lighting the tinder, lighting the fuel of the 1857 revolt. We are certainly aware of the political grievances of Indian rulers. Actually, many rulers were dispossessed of their domains, their kingdoms, etc. And even while they were promised some compensation, for an example, a lifelong pension for taking over of their kingdom by the British, ultimately all of these promises were mostly they were not kept by the British. Moreover, there was attack on the cultural sensitivity of the sepoys, whose foremost example was the probably a rumor over the brown rifle that contained, as the rumor was, cow and pork or pig fat. Moreover, there was general economic distress in the 1850s, and this economic distress got reflected in India too. But the origin of the outburst did not remain limited to India, but had demonstrably transnational connections. India was more than a fence-sitter. That we cannot say that India was not involved in world affairs. India was actually in the very thick of the world affairs, that India was central to the world affairs in international developments, and these were to justifiably influence events in India. Starting with the events in Britain itself, you can understand it, because it was Britain that was ruling over India. So events in Britain, that is domestic events, domestic politics in England, for an example, they would have certainly have had some bearings on India too. International events shaped the crisis that was to see eruption in the year 1857. So what was some of the international conditions that affected India and led to the Great Rebellion? First was the domestic politics of Britain. Actually, the contemporary British Prime Minister Palmerston, was known for his nationalism and colonialism. He had this policy of advancing Britain's interest over the interest of the colonies, and this ultimately meant exploitation of Indian resources for the benefit of Britain, and some other like policies that had ultimately adversely affected Indians. So all of this had led to the rebellion of 1857. They were causes for the Great Rebellion. Then comes the Great Panic of 1857. Actually, there was an economic crisis that was already brewing over in the most of 1850s, and it affected world economy. And this the hardships caused by the economic crisis of 1850s, which led to the Panic of 1857, these were the proverbial last straw that broke the back of India, that broke the, as they say, the last straw that broke the camel's back. In the same way, this economic crisis proved to be the last straw that broke the Indians' back, and they were compelled to rebel. These two events, actually, some historians say that these two events, that is Crimea War and the Second Opium War, these directly affected the situation in India. These influenced Indians in various ways, and this ultimately led to the 1857 rebellion. Taking up Crimea War, it ideologically influenced Indians because Nana Sahab's advisor Azimullah Khan was already present in Crimea. He had observed British vulnerabilities. And this war, actually, it had demonstrated the lie of British invincibility, which was observed by Azimullah Khan, who was an advisor to Nana Sahab II. And we can make this connection through Azimullah Khan. The Crimean War influenced the Great Rebellion of 1857. Then comes the Second Opium War. The war, it fueled grievances of Indian sepoys over perks and disregard of social customs. Actually, what was happening when the Second Opium War erupted, it was the Indian sepoys who were sent to suppress this war. They were sent to fight this war. And unfortunately, what was decided that they won't get their foreign service allowances. And this is why, while they were coming back, you would be probably aware that in most of northern India at that time, a person of high castes, actually most of the Brahmins, Bhumihars, Rajputs, and even Yadavs, Kushwahas and Kurmis, there was some prohibition, there were some restrictions on their going overseas. And when they came from overseas, if they indeed came from overseas, they were supposed to organize a feast for their friends, family and kin, their wider kin. And all of this cost them a lot. And this is why the sepoy, in this case, they were denied their benefits, they were denied their allowances. This would have meant great expenditure for them, and this ultimately caused some disaffection among the sepoys. Then you can understand the hardships caused by the cash cropping of opium. Actually, you can again make this connection that cash cropping is generally lucrative, but what happens if the cash crop failed, or like any kind of disruption in the trade of that crop, in this case opium, it would have led to this crop left on the field of the farmer, because the cash crop, the opium, could not be consumed like food grain. So ultimately all of this caused great hardship. Now taking up these points in detail. First, domestic politics in Britain decidedly affected their policies on India. The contemporary PM, Palmerston, was nominally a liberal, but in effect an imperialist, inclined to advance the British interests, including consolidation of colonies. This attitude found concrete expression in policies like the infamous doctrine of lapse. So ultimately, consolidation of the British position in India meant various forms of, you could say, conquest, or for that matter, the doctrine of lapse, through which the Indian rulers were dispossessed and all of their domains were, you could say, brought under the British sovereignty. And this was certainly resented in India. Then comes the economic hardships of the 1850s. These precipitated the Panic of 1857. It affected almost entire world, and it too started with the United States of America. the Panic of 1857, it had started with America, and what the British steps to counter the crisis led to flight of bullion. That is, bullion means precious metals like gold and silver, etc. All of me meant that they were pilfering India of its precious metal. You can make this connection of drain of wealth. So ultimately, what happened? The precious metals were pilfered from India. It was like draining out of India, and this would have ultimately caused great economic hardships for Indians, and Indians were forced to rebel. Then the two near contemporary events of Crimea War, which was fought between 1853 to 56, and the Second Opium War, which continued from 1856 to 60, they directly shaped the happenings in India. The reverses suffered by the British in Crimea demonstrated that British invincibility was a myth. Actually, before it was thought that the British could not be defeated, but the reverses, that is the like most of the losses that the British had suffered in Crimea, even though they were ultimately victorious, whatever, but the losses that were suffered by the British confirmed to Indians that the British could ultimately be defeated. They could indeed be defeated. It emboldened the rebels, and Crimea had a direct connection to 1857, as we were just talking about. Ajimullah Khan, who was an advisor to Peshwa Nana Sahab II, was in Crimea during the war. He had a personal experience of British vulnerability, and Mr. Ajimullah Khan had made connections with, he had established contacts with Russian and Ottoman spies. He had made contacts with Russian and Ottoman spies. This, you could say, this started the conspiracy of the 1857 rebellion. Khan dispelled any hesitation that Nana Sahab might have had in picking arms to overthrow foreign rulers. That he convinced Nana Sahab that only picking up arms was the last resort. And the Opium War that started in 1856 intertwined the fate of the Indian and Chinese colonies. As the celebrated historian Tan Chung, please highlight it, please underline it. The celebrated historian Tan Chung observes that the Chinese got opium, the British got tea, and the Indians got colonialism. So again, this statement, this observation is quite emblematic of the opium trade. The three parties, its effects on the three parties. You can understand very well that the opium trade would have harmed China directly. It harmed India too indirectly, that it led to the colonization of India, and it benefited only the British. So ultimately, the opium trade was harmful for all both India and China. This demonstrates the harm caused by the opium trade. As we were just talking about, conversion of crop lands to grow opium meant, it is MEANT, it meant a famine when the trade was disrupted, as for an example by the Opium War. As you can understand very well, opium could not be consumed like food grain. So ultimately, whenever there was some form of disruption in the opium trade, as in this example due to the Second Opium War, it meant that there would be some form of famine. Actually, there was already a famine brewing in India around 1857. And this is again a direct connection. The notorious General Services Enlistment Act of 1856 meant that the sepoy was compelled to serve overseas, contravening caste restrictions. That too without compensatory allowances. As we were just talking about, whenever the sepoy was when the sepoy came back from China, he was supposed to organize a great feast for his friends, family and kin, and this is while he was denied his allowance in the first place. So ultimately he was supposed to make this heavy expenditure out of his own pocket, and this was resented by most of the sepoys, as you can understand very, very well. So by through this manner, the Opium War meant the sepoys faced the movement of truth sooner than expected. What actually happened? The sepoy might have accepted the denial of the foreign service allowance, but due to the Opium War, he was forced to make this, you could say, make his step of rebelling against the British right then and there. So we can say that through these connections, that the domestic politics in Britain was decidedly imperialist and anti-colonialist, actually, in not in the interest of the colonies, in this case India. The general economic distress of the 1850s, which led to the crisis of 1857, and the two events of Crimea War and the Second Opium War, were in some form connected to the 1857 rebellion. They can be said to have influenced the Indian thought of rebelling, like they influenced Indians to ultimately rebel against the British rule, against the exploitative British rule. So this is how we sum up our answer for today. We hope to present another question in a few days. As usual, we wish you all the best. Thank you.